just following on a little bit from that introduction, I'm, as I said, a lawyer at White & Case. I've been practicing in the area of construction and arbitration for nearly 20 years now. So obviously this is something which I've had a lot of experience in, and today I'm going to be talking to you about completion, defects and termination. And these are things which probably don't come up that frequently, but when they do come up, obviously they're very big issues, particularly termination. Actually, the completion defects issue comes up on a lot of projects. Termination, hopefully, on not many projects, but it's obviously a very serious issue. And obviously these things are all interlinked, because terminations, when they do occur, are normally linked to very serious defects or failure to complete. In fact, it's hard to think of any other grounds on which an employer is likely to terminate. So, let's start with completion. You'll be pleased to hear that this is a very short section of the talk, and it's just to try and get you to think about the ideas around completion, and in particular, this point here. You know, is it a simple concept? I mean, who in the room thinks that completion very simple? Nobody's going to be brave enough to put their hand up, even if you're thinking that it's simple. You're not going to want to put your hand up. But I think most people think, oh yeah, you know, completion, that's pretty simple. You know, I build a building, it's, you know, when I finished it, it's complete. You know, I should get a certificate or something from the employer. Pretty simple concept. Actually, it's quite tricky, and for reasons that I will explain, here are some examples of questions that you need to think about in terms of completion. The first one is, and this is a very big issue on a case that I'm doing at the moment, what's included in the contract price? Again, you think that might be simple, but often it's not, because people may put together their contract using words from different pieces of contract, and so you might have a scope of work, but then you might have some other wording in the contract which makes it sound like, well, even if it's not included in this formal scope of work, you still have to do it. And that's a question really about the type of contract you have. Is it a, quotes, turnkey contract, where the contractor is supposed to build everything and the employer just comes along, turns the key at the end, the plant starts? Or is it a scope of work contract where the employer says, this is what I want you to build? Does every nail need to be hammered into place for the building to be complete? So if you have a house or apartment and it has a nail missing or a couple of other small items missing, does that mean it's incomplete? And here is a concept you will see sometimes a lot in English law between what are called patent defects and latent defects. So lawyers like to use, as you probably know, lots of fancy jargon, but this is pretty simple. So patent defects are the ones you can see, basically the ones that are obvious to you, either because you can see them with a naked eye, or because you know, you're experienced and you run a basic test and it's immediately apparent that there's a defect. And latent defects are things you can't see. These are in many ways more problematic. So, you know, a classic example would be you build a structure, all looks fine, but actually the structural steel does not have the design life which it's supposed to have. There is a case which I'll be talking about on that precise issue later on. So as a first question, I was wondering if anybody notices anything about this slide. Does anybody think if you were the employer, would you give me a completion certificate on this slide? Do you think the slide is complete? Or if you think it is complete, do you think there is a defect? So everyone's being very quiet, but I'm sure that some of you have seen that the last bullet point is missing a question mark. And this illustrates a concept which we will be talking about in relation to completion, because there are two ways of looking at that last missing question mark. I mean, first of all, it's not very serious. You can understand the slide perfectly well without the question mark. So nobody would regard this as rendering the slide completely useless, I hope. Secondly, it comes right at the end. So on one view, you might say the slide is incomplete because I just didn't add the last question mark. On the other hand, you might say, no, you completed the slide. It's just that you've missed the question mark off. That's a defect. And, had I missed one of the earlier question marks, maybe it would be more obvious that it was a defect, or you would more clearly say it's a defect rather than being incomplete. And that distinction between something being complete but with a defect or being incomplete is something that can have some surprisingly significant impacts. But turning back to the first bullet point, what's included in the contract price? And it is basically, certainly everything that's specifically mentioned. Nearly all contracts will have some kind of scope of work element to them, normally as an exhibit, often a very detailed specification. But one of the things I normally ask for when a client comes in is that I say, give me a copy of the contract, obviously. This is normally not as simple as you would hope, because first of all, there is normally a little tiny bit of relatively tiny section of contract which has got the legal terms in, and then there is normally another section to do with scope of work, which is normally like multiple volumes. So by the time somebody sends that to me, I end up with this multi-volume thing on my desk, and quite often, I mean, I don't even print out all of it if it's really like 50 lever arch files, which it can be. Generally not very good if it is, because people haven't really thought about what the scope of work is necessarily, and have just put together lots of different bits which may be inconsistent. There's also a very kind of obvious concept but can cause difficulty. So if there is a scope of work saying, for example, that you need all these structural steel pillars to be included in the building, and I'm selecting a deliberately obvious example here, even if it says structural steel pillars in the, so you need to erect these structural steel pillars in the building, I mean, fairly obviously the contract price also includes the manufacture of the steel pillars, the transportation of the steel pillars to the site, the storage if you need to store the steel pillars before you even get onto the erection of the steel pillars. So no scope of work tends to include all of that thing, although quite often people will try and cover that by some general language, but they probably don't really need to, because in interpreting contracts, whichever legal system or tribunal you have, they'll take a fairly common sense viewpoint, and some works are clearly implied by that. What gets trickier, of course, is if things change during the lifetime of the contract. So, for example, in that case, you would need storage. But what if, due to the employer's default, the project is delayed, so you can't erect the steel pillars when you originally planned to erect the steel pillars? Then you'll have some extra storage costs, which you may not have anticipated, and you may then be seeking money from the employer for that. And last, but can be very important, is the concept of a turnkey project. So the case I mentioned at the beginning, one of the big issues on the project is it's fairly clearly, in some sense, a scope of work project, because they have they're working on a vessel, an FPSO, and there is a fairly clear scope of work for what they have to do in relation to the vessel, and they don't have to do absolutely everything on the vessel. So it seems fairly clear it's a scope of work contract, but for some reason, probably because people are just using an old contract form and not really thinking about it, they agreed in it that it would be done on a lump sum turnkey basis, and those two words often go together. You often see lump sum and turnkey together. They're completely separate concepts, actually. Lump sum is just, the nature of the contract price. Is it a price? Is it literally a lump sum, so you get a lump of money for your work rather than being done on rates and materials? And turnkey, but it is a different concept. Turnkey is to do with the nature of the contract. So in a true turnkey contract, you get a performance specification, and then you just have to build something which satisfies the performance specification. Now, normally, employers, despite the fact that they want to have a turnkey contract, so they want to shift all that risk to the contractor, on the other hand, are not totally happy with just making it a performance specification. So usually you will find lots of additional things that you have to comply with. But the real true concept is you just say, for example, in a power plant, I want a power plant that generates this much electricity, this much on this level of reliability, these load factors and so on, and then you design a plant, and the employer doesn't care particularly what the plant looks like, what the internal engineering is, and so on. But it's very, very rare that any employer is as hands-off as that, although maybe they would get better results if they were as hands-off as that. So next concept, the what I might call the every nail concept. So I think you can probably immediately see that there would be a bit of an issue if on a huge plant or building or road or transport project, absolutely everything had to be completed in order for it to be complete, because you would presumably almost never get there, because the employer would always be able to come along and say there's a missing weld here, there's a missing nail here, there's a minor defect here which you need to rectify. So as a result of that, nearly all contracts distinguish, and in fact legal systems also tend to make the same kind of distinction between practical completion, or sometimes called substantial completion, and final completion. And the idea behind that is essentially that the contractor can get a certificate of practical completion even when there are various minor works not completed, minor defects left to be rectified. And final completion comes normally after a period of sort of running the plant as well. So part of the idea behind final completion is if there are defects which are latent but likely to come out pretty quickly, you find what they are before you get to final completion. And it's fairly obvious why this exists, because otherwise there's going to be a risk of significant injustice to one party or the other. Because if it was the case that all the contractor had to do was get to substantial completion, and then their obligations at that point became sort of non-existent, then the employer would be left without a complete plant. So the employer needs some kind of leverage to make sure the contractor comes and completes. And that's what final completion does. And normally there will be a retention. I don't know if people are familiar with the concept of a retention. It means a holding back of some money until you hit final completion. And this is a very sensible scheme, and anyone who, at least in the UK, who has ever bought a new house would wish that the same thing applies to new houses. But typically there the house builders have all the negotiating leverage and don't really allow people to negotiate the contracts. But what typically happens on a new house, at least in the UK, where we don't have such a great record of finishing works as you probably do in Korea, is you buy the house and then they try and say it's complete, and you go along and you find a huge list of problems with it, but still you have to pay the final purchase price, and then you have to spend a lot of time ringing up, hassling the builder to come and fix all the minor defects. And the reason that is so difficult is you have no leverage really, because they've got all their money, and it's obviously going to be a hassle for you to take them to go to court. So the concept, which is in sort of international and major construction projects, nearly always has this distinction between practical completion, where the contractor can get paid most of its money, and final completion, where it gets paid a small final element. And so that this concept actually, I think, works very well, and which is why you'll find it in almost every single major plant construction. I mean, interestingly enough, the one place where you will find it missing, obviously, and in my view this often leads to a lot of disputes, is you will often find it missing in the offshore industry. So you won't find this typically in a shipbuilding contract, and if you are doing things which are like ships, like FPSOs or drill ships or oil rigs, again, this concept may be missing. It may be included. It depends, you know, how the contract was put together, what the influences are, and what the negotiating strengths were of the different parties. But certainly my strong recommendation would be to include something like that. So patent defects, and effectively these are treated in the same way as minor incomplete works. And the reason for that is you can't, it's kind of difficult to sensibly distinguish between them. So as in the slide I showed you with the missing question mark, you could say that was incomplete, or you could say it had a minor defect. Either way, I think I would have been entitled to a certificate of substantial completion, and I could come back later and add the question mark. So again, this is a potentially fairly obvious point, that if you have a serious defect, it will likely prevent substantial completion. And if it is not a serious defect, then some substantial completion can and should occur, and it's supposed to be rectified usually as part of a sort of snagging list, which will be done between substantial and final completion. So the question may well arise as to, you know, well, what is serious? I mean, I think a very useful test is essentially, although there are many sort of different tests, and it's all a matter, the English courts at least, and I think most other legal systems tend to not want to be too specific for this, because they want to kind of judge it on a case-by-case basis. But you know, one very important point is to what extent can the employer use the building, the facility, without any problems, basically. So, you know, if you have a road and it is usable as a road, then you'll probably be at substantial completion, even if there is some minor finishing works to be done. On the other hand, there might be some minor works which have a very significant element, such as, painting the lines, which are required in terms of, stop signs and things like that. Okay, there might be minor works, but you can't use the road until then. So those will probably be regarded as serious. So another kind of interesting question is latent defects. So as I said, you may have a very serious defect which nobody knows about, and typically these are things like so industrial plant, for example, in turbines in power plants. I have a lot of cases at the moment where there is some defect in the turbine. Does that mean if you install a turbine which has got a defect, which means after a year the turbine breaks, does that mean that you didn't reach substantial completion? Another very obvious example is structural weaknesses in a building. You may, to give you some history on my career, I started as a lawyer in London. I then spent quite a long time in Tokyo, and before going back to London and finally coming to Seoul about 18 months ago. A few years ago in Tokyo, there was a very big scandal in Japan because people had been faking the earthquake resistance test, which obviously, if you're in Tokyo, is a very, very serious matter. So there were actually hundreds of buildings built with these latent defects in, most of which ended up all of which either had to be retrofitted if it was possible, or demolished if it was not possible. So again, people would have signed off, given you certificates of completion, but obviously there's a very serious defect. So a question which sometimes occurs, although I think the answer is reasonably straightforward, at least under English law, is, does that mean completion has not occurred? And the answer is no, completion has still occurred. It's just there's a defect in the building. So that was just to set the scene, and in particular on completion. I now have some rather more detailed slides on defects. So what I plan to do is get some way through this section on defects, cover legal principles, and then you may have noticed in the materials that you've been given there should be some 2 A4 worksheets, one of which is on completion and defects. And so at some point, what I suggest we do is we break, have 10 minutes, and then after that break, you kind of get into groups to discuss those points, and then we'll report back. So what is a defect? Here are a couple of definitions, both of which you may feel is stating the obvious. But you will see there's a couple of kind of key concepts. So it is essentially that the work or materials do not conform with the requirements of the contract. So again, and the second one also says not complying with the contract requirements. So the concept of defect is very much linked to whether it complies with the contract requirements. It may well be that the employer looks at what has been built and decides he doesn't like it very much. But if he hasn't specified it in the contract, you can't say it's a defect. For example, in a classic turnkey scenario, he may have set some performance requirements, then realizes that there are other aspects that are important. The answer normally is, well, that's just kind of hard luck. But what I've done to try and help understand what kind of defects you might have are what are kind of threefold classification of contractual requirements which you may not comply with. And as it says at the bottom, contracts typically contain a mixture of all three types. And the three types I have set here, although the wording can be confusing sometimes, are specification, standard, and purpose. What I have in mind for each of these is a specification is a very specific requirement that you have to comply with, and I will show you an example of a specification. A standard, for the purposes of this lecture, is not a specific requirement. It is more a level of quality that you need to undertake. So it is how the work is performed, typically, and the nature of the thing. So it is much looser than a specification. So we'll see that when we compare them. But it's worth bearing in mind, just on the topic of standards, and this is why I was saying the wording can be confusing. A lot of contracts say you must comply with, this particular standard, quality standard. Those kind of quality standards are actually what I would call a specification. So they're very specific set of requirements. And the UK publishes a lot, which tend to be used, and the US in particular publishes a lot. Most national countries have their own kind of specifications. Korea certainly has a whole load of specifications that you have to comply with, for example, in terms of electrical installations and so on. And those standards are often written into a contract. And those are really a form of specification. And the last one, the work may not achieve a specified purpose. And this is a very big topic under English law, may or may not be quite so big under other legal systems. But the idea here is that you want the final completed structure to comply with what it is intended to be fit for what it is intended to be used for. So, for example, if this room was designed so that it was impossible to hear anything that I said at the back, it would obviously not be very satisfactory as a conference room. It might be fine as a storeroom. So, turning to these three different categories, specifications. These are normally, you normally don't find these in the main body of the contract. These are normally in the 50 volumes that I was talking about, which may come as a contract attachments. They can be very highly technical. And I say here they may not be internally consistent, by which I mean that one specification may not be totally consistent with another specification. In fact, if I was to give you the benefit of my experience, I would say they are invariably inconsistent. And the reason they are always inconsistent, to some extent, is because people just pull out different specifications which they would like you to comply with, and nobody ever goes through them, or very rarely do people go through them with a sufficient level of detail to find all the inconsistencies. You may find during the tender process that contractors find a lot of inconsistencies, so I will often look at these contracts where there has been like 600 tender queries, of which several hundred are to do with inconsistent specifications, and despite that, people have missed some actually rather important inconsistencies. So those will always exist, I'm afraid, but obviously it's good to minimize them as far as possible. One of the big problems is that people don't, as I say, people just put the contracts together by grabbing different specifications, and the employer very rarely makes any effort to clear up inconsistencies. So normally the onus is always on the contractor to clear up the inconsistencies. And it tends to be even worse for subcontractors, because the contractors tend to have agreed on all of them these inconsistent things. Then they impose them on the subcontractors, and even if the subcontractor says, well, hey, these are inconsistent, the contractor is like, well, sorry, I agreed it with the employer, so I'm going to transfer the risk to you. So here's an example of a specification. This is actually taken from a project, dispute that I'm working on, and this actually, interestingly, was the subject of a dispute. And as you can see, it's full of very specific requirements. So there was a specific requirement as to the material. So there was basically a PVDF lacquer finish on an aluminium face, which is then on an aluminium honeycomb, which is a kind of method of construction wall panel. And there's also a dimension, 10 millimeter thick. Interestingly, you'll notice, and this is part of the dispute, there is only a dimension in terms of thickness. There is no dimension in terms of what size it should be. And it also tells you where it should be used. Wall panels. Another interesting thing in this case is that these were also shown on the drawings as on ceilings. So does that mean that they're how do you read those two things together? Wording, so as I said, wording can be used for what is really a specification document, e.g. British standards. But what I'm talking about in this presentation is a general requirement as to the work on materials. And as I say, it's particularly associated with workmanship, i.e. how the work is done, and quality issues. You will normally find this in the main contract document somewhere. So there will nearly always be some requirement for the sort of phrases we'll see on the next slide. But, and this also tends to be another inconsistency, you will also find in the specifications this kind of wording as well. So you will have something in the main contract which says one thing, and it may be a lower standard, and you have a higher standard in the specification. Again, you will tend to be held to the higher language. So here's some examples. So, and these are all from contracts that I just happened to have on my desk when I was putting this together. So, best quality workmanship. I actually, not only did I have that in the contract, I actually had a dispute about what that meant. In a proper workmanlike manner. I think that is actually in the FIDIC contract, in accordance with recognised good practice, something that is either from the FIDIC contract or something very similar is in the FIDIC contract. And you'll see, I mean, in order of onerousness, like strictness, these roughly run as you go down. So the highest one is the first one, best quality workmanship. In a proper workmanlike manner is probably not as bad as, in fact, definitely is not as bad or as onerous as best quality workmanship. In accordance with recognised good practice is probably actually not too bad, because then you just have to kind of comply with what people recognise as the good practice. And for example, if it turns out that everybody was doing it in a way which was wrong, the contractor would be not in breach. Under English law, and again, I think this is true of pretty much all legal systems, although their way of describing it may be different. If there's no express term about this, then some kind of term will be implied. So under English law, you will generally have to do things with reasonable skill and care. But you may also have to comply with this, which will undercut the reasonable skill and care obligation, which is the specified purpose. And again, English law will imply something along these lines, and people will often put it specifically in the contract as well. And this is usually referred to as fitness for purpose. And as I say here, it is scary for contractors. And anybody, why should that be? I mean, surely every contractor is going to build something which is fit for purpose. I think contractors can get too scared by this, but certainly the reason that people find it scary is the kind of vagueness. So, I may be caught out by some kind of purpose that I don't really understand. I didn't really realize that it would need to comply with this particular use and so on. So I think contractors are particularly scared by the feeling they are signing up to something they don't necessarily fully understand, particularly because people who are doing these contracts tend to be engineers. Engineers like to be very precise, so they would like, if I'm going to do something, I want a very precise thing that I have to comply with. This is a very imprecise thing. And actually the way this is normally done is, it's normally cut down by specific purposes. So most contracts will have some kind of performance output specification and a detailed description of what the building plant is going to be used for. So, and contractors will often say, and the purpose is limited to this, if they accept the wording at all. And then I have a question at the end. Well, what if it works fine and then it blows up or catches fire, something like that? It really depends on why it blows up and catches fire. If it blows up due to a defect in the a defect in the work which is being carried out, then fairly obviously it's not fit for purpose. On the other hand, if there is some unexpected other thing which has happened, it may not fall the fitness for purpose test. So there was a very recent example of a building in the UK which caught fire. They sued the contractor saying it was not fit for purpose because there was some flammable material in the roof, and basically the court had to try and work out, because nobody could really work out why it had caught fire, but they eventually came up with various causes, and it turned out that probably the most likely cause was I think a pest controller who came in and laid all these extra flammable stuff. So the contractor basically the case was not proven against the contractor. Couldn't be said that their work was not fit for purpose. And here is some other recent case law. This is a case which I think gives a lot of heart to contractors, because it's very easy to see it could have gone the other way. And in fact, at first instance, so in the lower court, it did go the other way. And this is a case where this is to do with an offshore wind farm. There was a design life of 20 years, and there was a fit-for-purpose obligation within the contract, although, as you'll understand from the decision, this was effectively cut down by other terms, the court decided. And what happened was there was a structural defect, which meant it was never going to last 20 years, and there would have to be very significant rectification in order for the wind farm structure to survive. And the reason for this was, interestingly, that a standard with which they also had to comply itself had a mistake in. So this standard, which everyone was using, had a mistake in. And when you designed to that, it ended up being a long way short of the design life for 20 years. So in first instance, the contractor was found liable because they said they had not satisfied the fitness for purpose test. the Court of Appeal took, I think, a much more commercial view and took the view that taking the contract as a whole, this was essentially an employer risk in the sense that they had followed the design life calculations in the contract and they had done what they were supposed to do in terms of that specification, which was wrong. And it was clear in the Court of Appeal's view that the fit for purpose obligation was cut down by reference to that term. So the contractor got off, despite there being a fit for purpose obligation. So that's a case a couple of years ago, very interesting. This is a lot of construction lawyers' favourite case, because normally we deal with things, like big buildings and offshore wind farms and things like this. This is something a bit more close to home. It is a domestic swimming pool. So this is a case involving a man who contracted to have a swimming pool built in his back garden. This is not the actual swimming pool, but this is kind of how I imagine it looked. And he was a Mr. Forsyth. And Mr. Forsyth had some very specific requirements for his swimming pool, which is perhaps not unusual. I mean, most people who are building a swimming pool would want, would specify the length, the width, and the depth. So a swimming pool being a three-dimensional structure, you would typically want it, if you wanted a 25-meter swimming pool and someone built you a 24-meter swimming pool, you'd be pretty unhappy, I guess. What happened here was that the contractor built a swimming pool of the right length and the right width, but was a bit too shallow at its deepest point. It was not as, it was a few centimetres too shallow compared with what it was supposed to be. So Mr. Forsyth was very upset about this, and he demanded that the contractor rectify this defect and rebuilt his swimming pool to the correct depth. Now, at this point, the swimming pool was all finished. I mean, had he discovered this while it was going on, then I think the contractor would certainly have had to have done that. And in the next kind of section of slides, there are lots of examples of correcting defects as you go along. But this defect was discovered, when it was complete, essentially. So obviously, a swimming pool, when it is complete, is laid with lots, laid with a lining on the bottom, lots of, waterproof panels, and so on, and all the way up the side, and obviously round there. Now, you can imagine that if you wanted to change the depth of this swimming pool here, you would have to basically go in and smash all of this stuff out. You would probably, I guess, wreck the sides as well. You would probably even wreck all of this paving round there, because it would be very difficult to do without machinery, which would come along and damage everything. So the reality is that the cost of rectification would be nearly as much as doing the job in the first place. So it would be very significant cost to do that. Although that, as I say, is the usual remedy. So this case, unbelievably, went all the way up to the highest court in England. And what happened was the builder admitted the defect. I mean, it couldn't really be denied, but said it was very unreasonable of Mr. Forsyth to demand this, because the pool was still perfectly functional as a swimming pool. And indeed, he couldn't really show, apart from his own personal wish to have a slightly deeper swimming pool, what loss of amenity there was. Going the wrong way. So there really was 3 possible measures for damages, and these were, in this case, very, very significantly different. So the usual measure is the cost of reinstatement. Another theoretical measure, although there have been very few cases, if any, where this has been done, although it has been kind of recognized in commentary and in both in judges' comments and in academic comments, that you could also do it on the basis of the difference in the cost to the builder between the actual work done and the work specified. So in this case, how much more, had the contractor done the job properly to start with, how much more would it have cost as compared with what was actually done? And finally, the last one is diminution in value. So this is how much less valuable is the swimming pool because it's a little bit shallower, which is basically effectively 0 in this case, because anybody who came and looked at this swimming pool, let's just go backwards. If you were selling this, so you wouldn't sell the swimming pool except with a house, but it's not going to devalue. To the extent the swimming pool puts any value on the house, it's not going to be any less because it's a little bit shallower. So it's very difficult to say any diminution in actual value, although you can have some, you can sometimes get awarded some small amount for your loss of your own personal amenity. So they were actually, the builder was arguing for 0, Mr. Forsyth was arguing for the cost of reinstatement, which was going to be very significant, and the court basically came down pretty much with the builder ultimately, although again there were different decisions in lower courts, and said no, that Mr. Forsyth is correct that the usual measure is rectification, but in this case Mr. Forsyth is being totally unreasonable in requiring it all to be demolished and trying to give all of that cost to the builder. So they just awarded him a very small amount of nominal damages for his kind of personal loss of amenity. So they didn't quite go for the builder's 0, but they went pretty close to it. So the real key point is the last bullet point here, which is why it's in bold, which is that the measure of damages is reinstatement unless the owner is unreasonable to insist. And again, you might think that this is unusual, but I've had this very issue come up on a power plant, so obviously very different to a swimming pool, where there was some minor non-conformity, but rectifying that minor non-conformity would have meant basically removing the turbines, putting some new turbines in, because it was just not possible to do with the turbines that had been installed. This case has not gone to a decision yet, but I imagine if it turns, if it goes to a tribunal, they will definitely agree that it would be totally unreasonable to do that. And so the measure of damages will be any loss in value that the owner was able to show, which again, I think we will be arguing is 0. So, and here is the very kind of important point, which is the relationship between defects and completion. So the presence of defects will not necessarily prevent substantial completion. If you recall our discussion on substantial or final completion, but the first point is it's a matter of fact and degree, so it really looks at how serious the defects are. And very significantly, if there are some performance requirements which you have to satisfy, so if there are some performance tests, which certainly there will be in kind of process plants, power plants, that kind of thing, then those, if they are required to be met as a condition for substantial completion, then they have to be met. So if you have a defect which hits one of those requirements, that will prevent completion. This can be very serious because, and this is why on one level, why are we talking so much about completion? The reason we're talking so much about completion is substantial completion is nearly always the trigger for liquidated damages. So if you are building something and you hit substantial completion, then at that point, you hit substantial completion on time, there will be no liquidated damages. If you are a week late, you will have a week of liquidated damages. So let's imagine a scenario where you have a reasonably significant defect which prevents completion of a performance test. In theory, and probably in practice, what that means is you cannot hit substantial completion. So you may have done all the work that you need to do, apart from this one thing, but you cannot hit substantial completion. And the liquidated damages will then continue to run. Probably they will continue to run until you hit the cap, which may be 10% of the contract price. So, one very, serious potential issue, and this kind of issue arises in one of my cases, is a relatively small defect can trigger some massive liquidated damages because it's a massive project. Massive projects tend to have massive liquidated damages of, hundreds of thousands of dollars per week. So for contractors, it is very important to be able to hit substantial completion and in a controlled way. So again, it's an area. The test for substantial completion is an area which really needs a lot of consideration if you are involved or having to look at drafting contracts.